This is my honors thesis looking at the social uncanny valley, exploring compensation and social anxiety in adults with autism spectrum disorder. So for those who don't know, what is ASD? And so it's a neurodevelopmental condition. It's definitely, it's something that can be diagnosed early on or something later. It's something that's very lifelong. But in this case, the biggest idea is that it's characterized by deficits in social interaction and communication. And so this is talked about through the idea of what we call theory of mind, which is the basic idea that we have this intuitive understanding of other people's mental states and ideas and motivations and intentions. And it's just something we kind of get, quote unquote. And people with autism tend to have a lot of difficulties in these, which can lead to social, behavioral, and cognitive difficulties. But some with ASD actually present with better overall outcomes despite these difficulties, while others don't. So why is this the case? And so one model that looks at this idea is what we call the compensation model. And this is where these individuals, even if they have these deficits in the theory of mind, they can present with good social skills behaviorally. What do I mean? So compensation specifically as an idea is a type of sort of behavioral camouflaging where they use their sort of higher level executive functioning and learning abilities to form mental rules. For instance, if you look on the right. So someone says a nonsense statement, and then let's say someone maybe laughs and doesn't laugh. It's hard for people mentally with autism to maybe tell whether it's a lie or if it's a joke. But if someone laughs, they can make a rule saying, okay, if this is nonsense and someone laughs, then it's a joke. So I know how to laugh. And so that's basically how compensation would work. And so this has been studied in adolescents a lot with ASD. And it allows them to present as being typically developing, even though they don't really understand how these mental states are working, which is why I sort of call it this uncanny valley in socialization. But there are cons to this process, even if it can help people with autism integrate. Mostly in that it's mentally exhaustive, since it isn't this intuitive process that we just kind of understand. And these rules can then also break down in complex situations because they're only so simple that they can only account for so many social ideas. And so both of these aspects together have been theorized, mainly by Livingston et al. 2018, which is what our study is kind of based around, that this could lead to higher anxiety. And this is actually confirmed in a lot of self-reports in adults with ASD as well. But there are still interesting questions to explore that Livingston and other researchers haven't. So what does this look like in adults? And so adults with autism especially is a very understudied group in the population versus children. And so looking at how these factors look into like later stages of development could be very beneficial for these adults clinically. And then how do they relate to other outcome measures besides just anxiety, for instance, self-esteem and psychological well-being? And so our current study's aim was to examine compensation, but to do this in adults with ASD instead of adolescents, while also assessing emotional and mental health measures. And so maybe this concept may be a little bit confusing. And so I brought up this graph from Livingston et al., which we're kind of emulating their design, which I'll get into in a bit. And so this kind of will get at the heart of what I'm talking about. So on one axis, you can see autism symptoms. And so the higher region over here are people with higher symptoms of behavioral symptoms. And then on the y-axis, you have theory of mind ability moving from higher from left to right. And so this is basically, you can see these split in the middle, and this basically splits into different groups with varying levels of autism and theory of mind. So in blue, we have this low compensation group. So these are people with autism who have high autism behavioral symptoms, but also low theory of mind. So this is more typical of people with autism. Then in red, we have this high compensation group. So this is our main area of focus. So these are people who have difficulties with theory of mind internally, but still are able to mask their symptoms and behaviorally compensate and basically not present as autistic. Then you have this deep compensation in green, which are closer to typically developing, people who have high theory of mind, but also have lower symptoms. And then we have this weird unknown group who have high symptoms, but also have good theory of mind for whatever reason. We'll get back to these people in a bit. And so I use that as a framework, as a way to sort of get across what my hypotheses are. And I'm going to reference this graph as we go, this type of graph as we go along. So the first is that in the high compensation group, so these are people with lower levels of autism symptoms, even with difficulties of theory of mind, compared to this group of low compensation who have high symptoms, that this group will have higher executive functioning, but also have higher social anxiety, and will also have lower self-esteem and lower overall well-being. And then we can also look at the high and the deep compensation group. So this deep compensation group is closer to typically developing. I believe that this high compensation group, compared to the deep, would also have lower self-esteem and lower well-being. And then lastly, in the whole sample, which is in purple here, that's the whole quadrant we'd be measuring, is that those with higher social anxiety in our sample would end up having lower well-being and lower self-esteem. So that's the setup. And so for our participants, we actually recruited all of these people online by social media forums, mostly ones where people with autism would congregate together, sort of related to autism. And so we recruited 179 people, and 0 of them were excluded by our attention checks, which are basically points within the measures, items basically saying, if you're paying attention, press this or do this, just so that we can tell whether they're paying attention or whether they're answering randomly or not. So everyone passed our attention checks, but 20 out of the 179 were excluded due to significantly missing data. And so that got us our final N of 159. There are a lot of stats here on the screen as well about different statistics, but there are 3 main things I want to point out. The first is the median age is of 25, so the majority of these people, or mean age, sorry, the mean age is 25, and so overall, these people tended to be between 18 and 25 within this sort of adulthood period, though we obviously had some people who were definitely older for sure. We had 78 males, 59 females, and 22 who self-identified in their gender. This is extremely critical in that the majority of autism diagnoses tend to be boys versus girls. It's a 4-to-1 ratio, which may or may not be actually representative of people with autism in general. And so this may actually be a more representative sense of what that sample could be. And then lastly here, the major piece I want to point out is that we actually had options to say whether you were professionally diagnosed in the sample or whether you were suspected. We suspected your ASD, and 72% said that they report a professional diagnosis, and 28% did not. We'll get back to this in a bit. So our procedure is actually really close to Livingston et al.'s in terms of what we're measuring, but we did it on an online form. So we did this through Qualtrics. So we did it through surveying through there. And so we did a demographic survey asking about ASD and diagnosis and age, and then they completed online questionnaires and tasks. So all of these scales, the 6 ones we used, all had high reliability. In that case, ranging from 0.85 to I think 0.94 on a couple of them. And so we first have a well-being scale and then a self-esteem scale. And then we have a social anxiety scale to go through that. And then we interrupt with like a multiple choice theory of mind task, basically getting the sense of exactly where their levels of theory of mind are in that scale. And then we have a symptom inventory for ASD for them to self-report their symptoms and the things that they're experiencing. And then we have an executive functioning survey that looks at difficulties with EF. The order here is critical because we don't want the theory of mind task or the ASD symptom inventory to interfere with the self-esteem. We actually got a few reports. We had like comments giving to provide feedback. And a lot of people said the theory of mind task was actually pretty upsetting, and we wouldn't want that to influence the well-being or self-esteem scales in any way, which is why we put that after. So just to go through our measures pretty quickly, we have the Autism Spectrum Quotient, which is a 50-item questionnaire measuring autism-related traits, self-reported, and this is out of 50, and so the higher the number, the higher the number of traits, and a score of 26 indicates usually a high probability of an ASD diagnosis. Then we have what we call a social attribution task. And so this is actually based on a lot of older tasks, but it's basically an animation that enacts a social drama. I don't have a clip for it necessarily because I only have so much time, but here's sort of a picture of what we have. And basically the idea here is you have a house and you have a whole bunch of agents and people who are here. So you have a person who's the big triangle fighting a little triangle and things like that. And so the whole point of this task is they would watch this video that would have that situation. And it's the job of people with autism to try to see, can they understand what the situation is doing based on how these objects are moving, whether one's looking scared or happy based on all of their movements. And so an 11 out of 19 has been used in cutoff for impairment in studies relating to schizophrenia, which is mainly where this has been used as far as we know. And then we have an executive functioning inventory we call the brief A. And so this is 75 questions relating to difficulties in executive functioning, with a higher score being related to higher difficulties in executive functioning. Then we have the Leibowitz Social Anxiety Scale, which is a 24-item Likert scale, technically 48 because each item measures fear and avoidance. So you have to report, it's basically duplicate items, and you have to report how much fear you have about this idea and then how much you would avoid it. And so the higher score indicates higher anxiety, and 60 has been used as a cutoff for things like social anxiety disorder, for instance. And then we have a short satisfaction with life scale. So this is a 5-item scale measuring satisfaction and well-being. And then a 10-item Likert scale, the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, which assesses general sort of self-concept and self-esteem. And now we get into our results. So first thing we did just to verify our groups is we ran an ANOVA between those who had a formal diagnosis and those who suspected their own diagnosis, basically to see how similar what they were, to see if we could include all of them in the study, basically regardless of outliers, things of that nature. And we actually found that despite the reporting, there was actually no statistically significant difference between the two of these groups. So it turns out that despite that, all of them in terms of their diagnosis, in terms of their ASD symptoms, are all about at the same level overall, regardless of diagnosis, which helped me feel confident in including them. Then we conducted a median split just like we saw at Livingston. So you'll notice all the different dots and you'll notice these lines, they're the median splits on these axes. And so we create group terms to separate them into the different groups. And so I color coded these the same way I did last time. And so you have blue, and so this is low compensation. So these are people with lower theory of mind and higher symptoms. In red, you have people who have lower symptoms, showing lower symptoms, but having a low theory of mind. Then you have people in the deep compensation group here. These are people who have low theory or high theory of mind and low symptoms, which is more typically developing. And then you have this unknown group here with higher symptoms and higher theory of mind. And so, and I keep these on the side just so you can see the comparisons of the groups here. And so we ran a t-test between the different pairs of groups. And so we did it between and basically saw what were the differences in these different variables and the way they measured. And we actually found, based on our hypotheses, that between the high and low compensation group, these are the people differing in autism symptoms, there was despite low theory of mind, there was actually no difference in executive functioning, social anxiety, self-esteem, or well-being in any of these groups. And the same thing was true actually for high and deep compensation, so more closer. So despite the theory of mind differences between these people here, there was not a significant difference in social anxiety, self-esteem, or psychological well-being. But we did find, we ran a couple ad hoc analyses just to look through the data, and we did find a statistically significant difference in social anxiety with this low compensation group, so people with poor theory of mind but high symptoms having higher social anxiety than this deep compensation group that is more typically developing. This makes sense given that these difficulties with theory of mind could lead to these things with anxiety, as well as maybe the difficulties that come with having higher symptoms overall. And then the same was true between the deep and the unknown group. And so the unknown group had higher levels of social anxiety as well, between whether you deal with deep compensation or not. And then lastly, we ran a few Pearson correlations. So we looked and we saw that social anxiety was negatively correlated in our sample with self-esteem and psychological well-being. And we found that for ASD symptoms, these symptoms were possibly correlated with executive functioning difficulties and social anxiety, but they were not correlated with self-esteem or psychological well-being. Now, what does all of this mean? Because these hypotheses are completely contrary to what we initially found in Livingston et al. So I pull up these both graphs to make a point. So you can look at the cutoffs here and these median splits that are happening between. And you notice that on the sort of range of the scales of the axes for the graph on the left, the original, the graph tends to be at the mid-range. The median split tends to be at the mid-range of the different measures. But for ours, you can see there's a much, much higher median split between the two. And so if we actually split it by the cutoffs of these different scores in order to get a better sense, you would get this. And so you would see that the vast majority of people would actually fall into this upper right category, which Livingston calls this unknown group, which are people with good theory of mind, but also high symptoms. That seems completely backwards to the idea of compensation, but there are two potential explanations for this. First is that this theory of mind measure hasn't been tested in ASD before. It's mostly been tested in schizophrenia. And so maybe this group could be higher functioning enough to pass this theory of mind task if it's sensitive enough, or the task may not be sensitive, even with the high reliability. So it's kind of hard to know. But the more important point is that the AQ, because this is an online study, has to measure self-reported internal behavior rather than the behavioral symptoms that are at the crux of the hiding of the symptoms with compensation. And so because of that, the AQ as a measure just may not be measuring the kind of construct that we really want in this case because of the limitations of an online sample. But these internal symptoms may still be useful in gaining an understanding of individuals with ASD. And then lastly for the discussion, those with social anxiety, social anxiety tends to be connected to EF, self-esteem and well-being. This makes sense because of the exhaustion that can maybe come from self-monitoring, which may have an impact on that executive functioning of people who are, let's say, trying to compensate, and and the social anxiety, which they were above the clinical cutoff for 60 for social anxiety. The whole sample may impact their ability to have other opportunities, to have relationships with other people, which may be something that could which then could then impact their self-esteem and well-being. But with ASD symptoms, they can relate to EF and anxiety, which makes sense given what's above, but it's not related to self-esteem or well-being. And positively, this could be because these are all people coming from online communities where they talk about autism, where they take pride in their autism, they understand it, and it's a part of their neurodiversity. And so that these communities may actually serve as support, social support networks and protective factors where they can have this understanding of one another, and that this could maybe buffer or cancel out the impact that regardless of ASD symptoms, this may not impact their self-esteem or well-being, even if their well-being tends to be a little bit lower overall. And then lastly, besides the limitations that we already mentioned, we can't verify if they truly have ASD without doing a behavioral measure like what we call the ADOS that actually looks at actual behaviors instead of things that are self-reported. And then because it's high functioning in nature, because you're having to reflect and understand, what your symptoms are and things like that, it may not be representative of the full population of those with ASD with many ranges of functioning. And so our future directions could maybe look at using these behavioral measures instead for things like compensation, maybe looking at the comparisons between self-report and these behavioral measures to see how those things map onto one another, how internal and external states can be affected with autism, and then studying these maybe protective aspects of autistic identity and seeing what it means to maybe create these social support networks rather than trying to deal with the sort of mental health consequences of trying to compensate for these difficulties. And so I want to thank Luisa Bonetto, my PI, Jessica Keith, grad student who's worked on this with me a whole bunch, Paul Allen, who's helped with a lot of the statistics for this, the whole of the lab I work in, developmental neuropsychology lab, David Dodel-Fader, the department, and the many participants in this study, especially from the subreddit R Autism. They were so helpful in this. And thank you to you for listening and being here. I couldn't be happier. And then here are my references.